Hello, good morning, everyone. I welcome you to today's training, which is part of the series and trainings we have been carrying out. And today we are going to look at the module is going to look at the impact assessments and cultural heritage aspects. So, and under this module, we are going to the topic is we are going to look at now is going to be an introduction to cultural impact assessments. And my name is Ukemeyelo. So first of all, let me just give a brief narration about cultural impact assessment. This form of assessment before now has been subsumed under the socioeconomic aspect of the broader environmental, social, and impact assessment. And this training is very timely in that it's going to expose us and try to extract these important aspects of assessment of impact of projects on our environment and try to make us understand that this is very key and has to be looked into in detail while trying to assess the risk and impact of a project on an environment. So, moving further, the overview of the presentation, this training is going to go through the process of, first of all, you're going to look at the concept of cultural heritage. Also, the next item you are going to look at is going to be the concept of cultural impact assessment. Then further down, we now look at the benefits of cultural impact assessment, the goal of cultural impact assessment, the scope of cultural impact assessment, and also we are going to look at the various projects that requires cultural impact assessment and the administrative processes that is involved in assessing the cultural impact of a project on the environment. Then further down, we now look at the approaches and the procedure for conducting a cultural impact assessment. So as we move along the training, if you have any questions, you can just jot them down and make it available at the end of the presentation and see how we can. So before we look at the assessment of the impact of and risk of projects on environment, the cultural impact assessment, let's first of all look at the cultural heritage. What is cultural heritage? Which is the important cultural heritage is really the important component which we are trying to manage as a way of ensuring that this important aspect is sustainable in the process of carrying out developmental projects. And cultural heritage, as we are going to look at, encompasses tangible and intangible heritage, which may be recognized and valued at local and national and global level. So in looking at the tangible aspect of the cultural heritage I have just explained, the tangible aspect of it has to do with the movable and immovable objects, such as the sites, the structures, the natural features, the natural landscape within an environment, the archaeological features within that environment, the historical and architectural, religious, aesthetic, and other cultural significant features within an environment. So those are the tangible cultural heritage within an environment which has to be looked at and assessed during the process of trying to set up developmental project within any environment. And the intangible aspect of the cultural heritage has to do with the practices, the representation, expressions, the knowledge, the skills, as well as instruments and objects, as well as an artifact within any community or area where developmental project is going to be set up. So that is the brief introduction about cultural heritage and the tangible and intangible aspect of it, which has to be looked at in the process of trying to assess the impact of developmental projects on the cultural aspect of the environment. So, as we further down to what I've explained, which is the cultural heritage, the cultural heritage also provides continuity between the past, the present and the future in intangible and intangible forms. What this means that the past features that have to do with the culture and the beliefs of the people is now married with the present as well as the future, in trying to ensure that these features are sustainable, are not diminished as a result of carrying out developmental projects. And also, the people identify with cultural heritage as a reflection and expression of their constantly evolving values, beliefs, knowledge, and tradition. So cultural heritage is considered as an integral aspect of sustainable development, which has to be enhanced and ensure that it is not tarnished as a result of setting up projects within that environment. So after looking at the concept of cultural heritage, let's now look at the main item of the training topic, which is the cultural impact assessment. What is it all about? So the term cultural impact assessment refers to the consequences to human population of any public or private policies and actions that significantly change their norms, values, beliefs, practices, institutions, as well as the way they live, work, socialize, and organize themselves as part of their cultural life. So in looking at cultural impact assessment, it's just a way of assessing the consequences of developmental projects, whether it is in the public or private sector, as well as policies and action. How are this project going to have an impact on the values, the norms, the beliefs, and practice of the community or individuals that are within the area whereby this project is going to set up? So that is what in a nutshell is meant by the assessment of the cultural aspects of the environment. So what is the goal of cultural impact assessment? What does it seek to achieve? In carrying out cultural impact assessment, what do the assessor tries to achieve by carrying out the assessment? First of all, it seeks to enhance the preservation and promotion of the cultural diversity of the affected communities, with a view to ensuring that they are sustainable, ensuring the sustainability of the developmental actions and policies. What this means that in order to ensure that the developmental actions and policy, which is the project we are bringing to an area, is sustainable, the cultural aspect of the people within that area has to be preserved or promoted as a way of ensuring that the cultural diversity is sustainable. Also, another goal of carrying out cultural impact assessment is to provide planners and decision makers with better information about the consequences which developmental actions and policies could have on the cultural environment. Like I said earlier, this cultural environment has already, before now, has been subsumed and we form only a minute part of the overall environmental impact assessment. So in assessing the cultural aspect of the environment in the broader scale, to help planners and decision makers to be better informed about the consequences of these projects within this environment. So what are the benefits of carrying out a cultural impact assessment? And one of the benefits includes it is going to increase certainty and understanding of the effects on cultural values, and will also reduce the risk of unintentional, unexpected effects from consented activities. So what this means that is going to help us to understand the effects, whereby some of these effects could be unintentional or unexpected, whereby we may not envisage them or are aware that these projects have an effect on the environment. So the benefit of you carrying out cultural impact assessment will ensure that they have a broader understanding of this effect of this project. Also, is also going to improve relationships and communication routes that facilitate more effective future contacts and outcome of all parties. So all parties that are involved in carrying out this project are going to there are going to be an improved relationship and communication within them as a way of understanding the cultural heritage within our environment through the process of assessing them. Also, another benefit is that it's going to encourage active participation of local communities with cultural heritage in resource management, and also it's going to improve the representation of the interests of the local communities. So the interest of the local community is going to be protected and represented in the process of carrying out cultural impact assessment after you must have had the baseline information or understanding of the cultural information within that area. Then finally, another benefit that could be accrued from carrying out cultural impact assessment is that it's better cultural and environmental outcomes, as in the cultural and environmental outcomes will be much more better appreciated than not maybe as subsuming it into the broad environmental impact assessment. So in the process of carrying out cultural impact assessment, there are a number of international regulations or treaties whereby the assessor of the cultural impact assessment has to have foreground knowledge of, and also in the process of trying to foresee the cultural and foresee the cultural consequences of the project. These few international instruments has to be adhered to. You have to have that at the back of your mind while coming up with the plans and programs of carry out a cultural impact assessment. First of all, is that it's going to help in ascertaining whether policies or projects will conform to other international standard setting instruments or culture, such as the 2001 UNESCO Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity, the action plan of the 1998 Stockholm Intergovernmental Conference on Cultural Policies for Development, and the last one is the 2002 Istanbul Declaration on the Intangible Cultural Heritage. So these are the few international instruments that the assessor has to come up with as a way of ensuring that the cultural impact assessment that is carried out within any environment is carried out up to the international standard that is required. So what is the scope of cultural impact assessment? To what extent can we go in the process of carrying out cultural impact assessment? So cultural impact assessment is the method of analyzing what impact a development policy or action may have on cultural aspects of the environment. And one way of trying to look at this is that cultural impact assessment is going to cover areas like the ways people cope with life through their economy, rural system, and their values. Also, cultural impact assessment is going to cover areas like the way people use the natural environment for shelter, making livelihood, industry, worship, recreation, and gathering together. So where all these gathering points, where they come around together, cultural impact assessment is going to help to assess the way the people appreciate this natural social gathering environment. Also, another area where cultural impact assessment is going to cover is the way communities are organized and held together by their social and cultural institutions and beliefs. So those are the areas whereby in the process of carrying out a cultural impact assessment, it's going to cover those areas. And furthermore, cultural impact assessment is going to cover areas like the ways of the ways the community values are expressed and how they choose to identify with this cultural heritage within this area. Furthermore, cultural impact assessment also will cover areas like the arts, the music, the dance, the language, the crafts, drama festival, and other expressive aspects of the culture of the people within that environment. Furthermore, the group value, that is the values within the communities and their beliefs about appropriate ways to live, the family and extra family relationship, the status of relationship, means of expression, and other expression of the community will be covered as part of carrying out cultural impact assessment. Then finally, the aesthetic and cultural character of a community or a neighborhood in its ambience is another item that cultural impact assessment will cover. So that is the scope of the areas whereby cultural impact assessment will cover. In carrying cultural impact assessments, all those areas of human life within the neighborhood, the community whereby the projects are being set up is going to be covered. Then, after looking at the scope, the areas, and the how wide cultural impact assessment can cover. So, what are the kind of projects that requires cultural impact assessment? So, first of all, projects that require cultural impact assessment will involve like excavation or other environments that will require cultural impact assessment. Project that has to do with which is located within legally protected or legally defined buffers zone. So projects that are located within legally protected areas and buffer zone requires cultural impact assessment. Why this is important is because the protected areas have some of the cultural beliefs, the vegetation or the items within these protected areas have been preserved over decades and hold some of the beliefs and values of the people within that area. So in setting up any project within this area requires that you carry out a comprehensive cultural impact assessment. Furthermore, projects that require cultural impact assessment also has to do with project which is located in the vicinity or is recognized as cultural heritage sites. So any site that is recognized as cultural heritage site requires for you to carry out a cultural impact assessment, not just you carrying out environmental impact assessment, but the cultural impact assessment has to be studied and assessed in detail. Then lastly, project which is specifically designed to support the conservation, management, and use of cultural heritage requires cultural impact assessment. So what are the principles that are involved in carrying out cultural impact assessments? So the following principles, as I'm going to outline, forms the benchmark for you that is required in the proper conduct of cultural impact assessment. So the first of the number one principle has to do with the public involvement, consultation, and participation. This, in other way around, could be termed the stakeholders engagement, or maybe the scoping phase, whereby you have to involve the public and consult wide in the process of carrying out this assessment. So considering that cultural impact assessment is primarily concerned with determining and addressing the concerns of the public. So public involvement is very essential in carrying out this assessment. Furthermore, it is essential to determine who the affected segment of the public are and how they are organized and how their active participation could be assured. So you have to understand which segment of the public you are going to consult or you are going to involve in the process of carrying out the cultural impact assessment, so that you now know how to address issues that has to do with these different segments. Then the second principle that has to be adhered to in the process of cultural impact assessment has to do with the analysis of to analyze impact equitably. So as a basic aspect of cultural impact assessment is to identify all groups that are likely to be affected by a development policy or action. All the groups that are likely to be affected, whether they are directly or indirectly has anything to do with the project, they have to be identified. This ensures that you are equitable in the process of analyzing the impact or getting information from these groups in the process of trying to analyze the impact from that has to do with the cultural impact assessment. So no category of persons, particularly those that might be considered most sensitive and vulnerable as a result of so their age, maybe their gender, their ethnicity, and their race, should be left out in the process of carrying out cultural impact assessment. This will ensure that the analysis of the impact of these assessments will be equitable, will be fair, and not biased. So another principle that you have to adhere to in the process of carrying out cultural impact assessment has to do with the focus on the assessment. So cultural impact assessment practitioners must contain with stringent time and resources that affect the scope of the assessment and how much can be done within this time frame. So within a short time frame or with the resources you have, you must focus on trying to ensure that the proper assessment is carried out within this time frame. So in doing that, you have to focus on the most significant impact in order of priority, and all significant impact for all impacted group must be identified early using a variety of rapid appraisal and other participatory inquiry techniques. So techniques like such as the focus group discussion, the participant observation method, your survey should form part of the significant means where you use to assess the cultural impact assessment within the resources and available time frame. Then another principle you have to adhere to has to do with identifying methods and assumptions. So the methods and assumptions used in cultural impact assessment should be made available and published prior to a decision in order to allow decision makers as well as the public to evaluate the assessment. The information that you are trying to send out to the public, or the ways in which you are trying to carry out your assessment, the methods and all the assumptions you made have to be shared with members of the public in order to get contributions from them and feedback on how to ensure that the assessment is done in a standard way. Then another principle that we have to adhere to in the process of carrying out cultural impact assessment has to do with defining the significance of your impact. So a cultural impact assessment should discuss how the significance of a cultural variable or an impact is represented. So the necessity of making one variable more significant than another should be made explicit. We have to try to inform the gathering or the public on why you choose to make one variable that has to do with the risk or impact of a project more significant than the other one. This will show accountability and fairness in the carrying out the assessment process. Then furthermore, another principle has to do with providing feedback to project planners. So there should be an active feedback process between the cultural impact assessor and the planning agency throughout the assessment and planning process. So feedback will help in trying to design mitigation and adverse impact of a project and also enhance the positive ones. So this is like a iteratory process of carrying out the assessment, whereby whatever feedback you have in the process of trying to carry out assessment is now being feedback to the system in order to design, come up with new mitigation measures for the adverse impact and enhancing the positive ones. Then another principle also has to do with the using of professional, trained, and qualified cultural impact assessment practitioners. So the trained cultural cultural specialists will use appropriate professional methods, which will also provide best results in the process of carrying out cultural impact assessment. And the practitioners will include experts like anthropologists, archaeologists, ethnologists, cultural geographers, and members of related professions like sociologists and cultural history. These are the professionals that should be engaged in carrying out cultural impact assessment in order to ensure that the assessment is standard and could stand the test of time. Then another principle that should be stick to in the process of culture impact assessment has to do with establishing monitoring and mitigation programs. So a culture impact assessment should not only provide the agency with an analysis of impact, but also the basis of setting up programs to mitigate cultural impact and monitor how this program work. So you have to come up with programs on how to monitor or mitigate the impact of a project on the cultural environment, and also come up with ways of monitoring this program that has been put forward. How have they been faring in terms of trying to mitigate the impact of the project on the cultural aspect of environment? So by identifying a monitoring infrastructure, a key element of the local planning process is trying to ensure that this monitoring and mitigation program is monitored or is adhered to strictly. So another principle that you have to observe in carry out proper culture impact assessment has to do with identifying the data sources. So what are the data sources that you are going to use for your cultural impact assessment? So as a matter of good practice, cultural impact assessment should identify the sources of data and information upon which the analysis is going to be based on. And there are three sources of data which you have to consider in trying to identify the source of data. The three sources have to do with the published scientific literature, the secondary data, as well as the primary data. So the published scientific literature has to do with books, journals, and reports, while the secondary data includes vital statistics, agency reports, and government reports from government agency. Furthermore, the primary data includes sources such as the field research, oral interviews, and history of informants in which you gather in the field. So this will form the primary data source for carrying out a cultural impact assessment. Then finally, you have to plan for gaps in the data. So in planning for the gaps in data, you have to understand that no cultural impact assessment collects all the required data. So the cultural impact assessment should honestly identify gaps in the data based on information that are probably not in existence but cannot be gathered. And also questions and uncertainty about data should be tried to be addressed. Those gaps have to be filled in trying to ensure that your data for the impact assessment, cultural impact assessment, is of standard and not biased. So what are the administrative processes? What are the processes that are supposed to be carried out in terms of administrative process when it has to do with cultural impact assessment? So first of all, it has to do with the natural cultural agencies. But before now, let you understand that these administrative processes are not strictly pertaining to one country. It's like a general process which is sourced from various research that has been carried out in cultural assessment that has been carried out in different countries. So a particular country would have maybe part of this administrative process which is now tailored to their own laws and regulations when it has to do with assessing impact of projects within our environment. So the National Cultural Agency prepares a ministerial memorandum and identify as well as define those projects which will be subjected to cultural impact assessment procedure. So that's the first step in the administrative process of cultural impact assessment. You have to identify and define the projects that requires cultural impact assessment. This has to do with trying to categorize the projects that we are supposed to be carrying out and try to see if it requires cultural impact assessment and what procedure are you going to adopt for that. Also, the Natural Cultural Agency, which could be in our own environment here, the Federal Ministry of Environment, and other regulators that has to do with this topic, we will set out the basics for the cultural impact assessment guidelines. And furthermore, the responsible ministry will also set out the principles for the cultural impact assessment. Then the project proponent, which is the individual or organization that is trying to set up a project within the environment, will have to prepare a draft of the cultural impact assessment. Maybe this could be handled by the consultant that is handling the project for the proponent. So the draft of the cultural impact assessment has to be prepared. And after that, a notification to public inspection of the project plan and draft of the cultural impact assessment by the concerned local government authorities. So the local authorities, the communities, the local government within the environment have to be notified about these projects, the plans, and as well as the draft of the cultural impact assessment. Then furthermore, the project proponent has to organize briefing meetings with concerned affected groups and community. This is a way of trying to engage the communities, maybe through stakeholders engagement or the scoping, trying to engage them and maybe brief them about the proposed project within the environment and how this will affect their own livelihood, their cultural heritage within the environment, and try to receive feedback as in a way of their concern about the project. Also, a presentation of written comments from concerned members from the community should be documented. This should be in a written hard document whereby it can be pulled out anytime for reference purposes. Also, the views and comments of the concerned local government authority has to be inculcated in the process of carrying out this cultural impact assessment. Then finally, in preparing the cultural impact assessment, there have to be preparation of the draft report by the project proponent. Then after that, a notification and public inspection of the final cultural impact assessment by the concerned local government authorities and representatives of the affected groups. Then comments and observations of the Natural Cultural Agency, which are submitted directly to those who issues the license. So in the regulator or in the organization that issues the license for a project to be carried out within that area has to be availed with the comments and observations that were received in the process of carrying out this cultural impact assessment from the different stakeholders that were involved. So another stage in the administrative process when it has to the cultural impact assessment has to do with the due consideration of the views that were taken in the processing of the license by the licensing authority, and the issues of licensing to the project proponent by the licensing authority should be undertaken as part of the proposed development activity. So lastly, the civil society and private sector should be involved in an active partnership with the public sector to ensure that its application as a standard development practice, as the cultural impact assessment, is applied and as a standard developmental practice in assessing the impacts and risk of projects within any environment. So in looking at the administrative process, what are the brief approach whereby every cultural impact assessment has to go through is what we are going to look at next. And this has to do with a multidisciplinary and a systematic predictive nature. So the process has to be involve experts from various disciplines and must be carried out in systematic and predictive nature. So the approach whereby you have to carry out cultural impact assessment has to be, first of all, reviewing the existing state of the cultural environment and the characteristics of the proposed action and possible alternative action. So the existing state of the cultural environment has to be reviewed, and I also look at probably alternatives to manage the impact or risk that is attributed to this project within the environment. Then also, as a way of trying to carry out cultural impact assessment, it also involve predicting the state of the future cultural environment with or without the action. So you are trying to predict, look at what will the cultural environment look like, whether this project comes on board or not. So that is one of the approach to ensure to carrying out cultural impact assessment. Another approach is considering methods of avoiding, eliminating, reducing any adverse impacts and possible compensation for them. This is like a mitigation hierarchy which you have to adopt in the process of trying to mitigate the adverse impact of the project on the cultural environment within any location. Then furthermore, you have to prepare a cultural impact statement or a cultural assessment report, which is the final report, which discusses the issues and the information that were received from various stakeholders in order to influence decision makers, in order to inform decision makers on the right step to take as regards the assessment that has been carried out. And finally, a decision has to be made about whether or how the action should proceed. That's in terms of monitoring the impacts that will occur as a result of the project and acting on the result of such monitoring. So in monitoring the impact of the project on the cultural aspect of the environment, the results of this monitoring also has to be acted upon in order to come up with further, maybe more improved design of mitigating the adverse impact of those projects on the environment. So the next item we are going to look at is the procedure for conducting cultural impact assessment. Now, this particular aspect is going to be, I will just give you a brief steps that are to be carried out in the process of understanding cultural impact assessment, because this topic is going to be discussed in detail tomorrow as part of the guidelines for carrying out cultural impact assessment. And the first step as part of the procedure for carrying out cultural impact assessment has to do with developing an effective public involvement plan so that all affected interests will be involved. So all the affected interests have to be involved, and how to ensure that is for you to develop a public involvement plan. In the second step, as part of the procedure for conducting cultural impact assessment, has to do with describing the proposed action or policy change and the reasonable alternatives. So the proposed changes that you envisage that's going to come up as a result of this project has to be predicted and described, and also come up with the alternative measures of trying to avert or reduce this risk or impact. Then the third step that you have to carry out as part of the procedure is define the baseline condition. So what is the baseline, the current status of the cultural heritage within that environment? That has to be established. Then the first step has to do with identifying and defining the significant impacts. The fifth stage has to do with investigate the significant probable impacts. So the impact that has been identified and defined as being significant has to be further investigated. Then the sixth stage step in the procedure for conducting cultural impact assessment involves predicting the response of the affected communities to the anticipated impact. So you have to come up before the communities start airing their views. You on your own have to predict the responses and come up with ways in which you have to address these concerns. Then the seventh step involves considering the direct and cumulative impacts of the project. Probably maybe if there was another project within that environment, what would be the cumulative impact of this project within that environment on the cultural aspect of that environment. Then the eighth step has to do with recommending new alternative and also need for new, maybe visible design in terms of trying to reduce or minimize the impact of the project within that environment. Then the ninth step has to do with developing a mitigation plan. You have to come up with a mitigation plan whereby the impact of the proposed projects and the risk within the cultural aspect of the environment has to be mitigated, going through the various mitigation hierarchy that we have listed earlier. Then the final step has to do with developing a monitoring plan and program, whereby you constantly monitor the impact and the risk of the projects on the cultural aspects on the environment. So we've come to the end of the training. So